Handcuffed and running for her life, Cindy ran into the middle of the road, hoping a driver would stop and save her. Chasing her was a murderer who was planning on tracking and hunting her for his own amusement. In the 1980s in Anchorage, Alaska state troopers had noticed a pattern beginning to take shape, a pattern too disturbing to dismiss. Over the past decade, women who worked the streets had been vanishing. At first, it didn't raise many alarms. In a transient world like theirs, disappearing wasn't uncommon, and many assumed these women had simply moved on, started over, or met with unfortunate but non-criminal fates. But then, the bodies started to surface. 17-year-old Cindy Paulson lived with her mother in Anchorage in 1983, making a living as a dancer while also working the streets to make ends meet. On one fateful night, a man approached her, introducing himself as Don. As he seemed somewhat out of the ordinary, Cindy didn't dare go anywhere with him, but agreed to join him in his car. She sat down and near the passenger seat, and before Cindy could react, he slapped a handcuff on one of her wrists. A cold metallic click sealed her fate. Moments later, he drew a gun. Her heart raced as he secured her other hand with another set of handcuffs. Panic swirled, but Cindy forced herself to focus. If she was going to survive, she needed to memorize every detail. Every moment mattered. The man drove Cindy to his home. Inside, her nightmare only deepened. Bound and terrified, she endured hours of torment. Then, in a chilling twist, the man began showing off his hunting trophies, proud displays of his skills. He'd introduced himself as Don, but now the truth stared Cindy in the face. His real name was boldly engraved on the awards. Cindy begged for her life, but the man's response was cold and calculated. He claimed he'd take her to a remote cabin after a stop at Merrill Airfield. He promised she'd return, but Cindy knew better. There was no coming back from this. She had seen his face and knew his name. What she didn't yet know was that this stranger wasn't just a hunter of animals. He hunted women. His dark obsession drove him to kidnap women, force himself on them, and then the most horrifying part would still be ahead of them. He'd fly them deep into the cold Alaskan wilderness before releasing them with nothing but the ropes he had used to bind their hands. And after giving his victims a head start, he would track them like prey, armed with a rifle or his hunting knife. This was the fate he had planned for Cindy. By 5 a.m., they arrived at Merrill Airfield. The man exited the car to fuel and prepare his plane, leaving Cindy alone for a crucial moment. Adrenaline surged. She lunged into the driver's seat, wrestled the door open despite her cuffed hands, and bolted into the icy darkness of Anchorage. Barefoot, handcuffed, and desperate, Cindy ran with everything she had. Behind her, her kidnapper spotted the escape. He gave chase, his shouts cutting through the early morning stillness, but Cindy didn't stop. She reached 6th Avenue just as a pickup truck rolled by. The driver, startled by the sight of her disheveled state, immediately pulled over. She asked the driver, a man named Robert Hansen, to take her to a nearby motel where her boyfriend was staying. Still at the airfield, her kidnapper made his way back to his car and quickly sped off. However, an observant security guard took notice of the man's strange behavior and wrote down his license plate and car model. Once Cindy was inside the motel, she managed to call her boyfriend from the front desk phone, her hands trembling as she dialed. A concerned motel employee, alarmed by her condition, wasted no time in alerting the Anchorage Police Department. When officers arrived, Cindy was hysterical, screaming, "He's going to kill me." It took time to calm her down, but once she regained control, Cindy gave a chilling and highly detailed account of what had happened. She described her kidnapper's car, the layout of his home, the street where his property was located, and even specifics about the gun he'd used to threaten her. Less than an hour after Cindy escaped, she was in a police car headed for the hospital, as was standard protocol for these types of crimes. While en route to the hospital, they drove past the same airfield Cindy had just run away from. She remembered which area of the airport that she had been taken to, and what her kidnapper's plane looked like. Cindy then asked the officer to stop so she could lead police to precisely where her kidnapper's blue and white plane was still parked. Noticing the scene taking place, that same security guard who noted down her kidnapper's license plate flagged down the officers and shared his information. With the details of the kidnapper's car and the plane's registration, Anchorage police contacted the Federal Aviation Administration for final confirmation. As officers pulled into the hospital with Cindy, they received a call about the plane and car. They had found a match. They belonged to a man named Robert C. Hansen. This was the name Cindy had seen on the hunting trophies in her kidnapper's house. However, when the police approached Hansen, everything seemed to check out. His alibi was solid, and a few of Cindy's details about his home didn't add up. Among the inconsistencies was the place in the house where Cindy had been held. No room in the house matched that description. More importantly, the police knew Robert Hansen well. He was the mild-mannered baker from the neighborhood, a devout Christian family man who had always seemed harmless. Despite Cindy's terror-filled testimony, the investigators dismissed her story. A while later, while working at a club, Cindy's heart froze as she saw Hansen again, casually walking in. She realized the police hadn't done a thing. Despite this, Officer Greg Baker believed Cindy's account, and something about Hansen didn't sit right with him. Determined, Baker dug into Hansen's background, and what he found was shocking. Beneath Hansen's mild-mannered facade lay a lengthy criminal history, one that stretched back years. Baker quietly compiled his findings and handed them over to the Alaska State Troopers, who, in contrast to the APD, took the case very seriously. Cindy's case fell into the hands of Trooper Glenn Flothy, a meticulous and relentless investigator. He interviewed Cindy himself, listening carefully as she recounted her nightmare. He believed her. And now, with a growing mountain of evidence, it was time to act. One morning, two officers casually approached Robert Hansen and asked if he could accompany them to the station to answer a few questions. Hansen agreed, appearing calm and unbothered, never asking what the questions were about. But as he sat in the interview room, officers were swarming his home and his plane, executing search warrants. At Hansen's house, time ticked by with excruciating slowness. Hours passed, as officers combed through every corner, every drawer, every shadowed space. Hansen's 5-hour interrogation had ended, and he'd already been transported to the jailhouse. But the evidence they desperately needed, trophies, jewelry, keepsakes, was nowhere to be found. What they did find was a significant cache of firearms. It wasn't enough to seal the case just yet, but the clock was ticking, and the hunt for the truth was only just beginning. As the night edged closer to midnight, the search team was now down to just one last stretch of the house, the attic. It was the one place they hadn't yet explored. They started probing the wooden walls, half expecting it to be a dead end. But then something shifted. One of the panels gave way. And there it was. A room exactly like Cindy had described. The room the police had once dismissed as fiction. The air seemed to thicken as they stepped inside, and that's when they saw it. Several firearms, but most crucial of all, a Ruger Mini-14 semi-automatic rifle. The same rifle that had been used to murder 2 women, one of them who was found only a month before the search. Then they found something else that changed everything. Tucked behind Hansen's headboard was an aeronautical chart, with 24 different marks scattered across the map. As the investigators tried matching them to the sites where bodies had been found, the horror hit them with full force. They were standing in the house of a man who had murdered maybe 24 women, and only 4 of these were found. The police kept their discovery of the map a secret from Hansen. As the evidence piled up against him, a grand jury handed down 4 indictments against Hansen. His defense team scrambled, trying filing motions to have crucial evidence thrown out, but the legal system was closing in. When Hansen finally sat in court to discuss the motions, the judge's words were like a hammer striking a nail. Prosecutor Frank Rothschild described it like this, quote, "The judge handling the case made it very clear that the Alaska State Judiciary was not going to look favorably on this guy and what he's done and somehow cut him a break or find a new law that was going to free him up in any way, shape, or form. The way that hearing went and the way the judge acted gave him a message. He realized, okay, I'm screwed here. They got me, and legal wrangling is not going to get me anywhere. Hansen's legal team approached the DA to negotiate a deal. They agreed that if Hansen gave a full confession, he would only be charged with 4 of his murders and avoid a lengthy and public trial, sparing Hansen and his family the ordeal. That meant that Hansen had to confess to all murders he had committed, both the ones the police knew of, as well as the ones the police were not yet aware of. At this point, the police only knew about 4 of them, but they suspected a lot more. Hansen spent the morning confessing to the murders and answering the DA's questions. He only confessed to the murders he knew the police were aware of. After a few hours, Hansen finished his confession, and they had lunch. Then, when they returned, the DA Victor Krum told Hansen that he knew Hansen was not confessing to everything, and that when spring came, they would check the grave sites marked on the aerial map that they found at Hansen's house, and charge him with the murders of each of the victims they found. This was the first Hansen heard of the police having his map. If more of his victims were found, and he hadn't confessed to their murders, he would be charged, and the lengthy public hearing he would hope to spare himself and his family from would be a reality. Hansen turned red and angry, transforming from the mild-mannered baker and into the murderer who had killed at least 4 women. He stuttered a bit while asking to have a moment to talk with his legal team. After going into a nearby conference room, the entire floor they were on could hear Robert shouting. He came back into the room where the DA was waiting and gave a more detailed confession, including many more of his victims. He was ultimately sentenced to 436 years in prison, in addition to his life sentence. He died in prison in 2014. Cindy went on to marry and raise 3 children. Years later, when a movie was being made about her story, the director tracked her down and interviewed her. When Cindy saw the finished film, she sent a letter to the director. In it, she wrote that she felt like a weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to learn more about this, my sources, as well as corrections, if any, will be in the video's description. I'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you feel I deserve it, you can click the like button or subscribe, and I hope you'll watch my next video as well.